culture traditionally, there is a connection between heaven and earth, and it is the medium of the people. And I think that that is the wonderful thing that wine is, because it contains so much of human culture, human history, but then you are reliant on heaven and earth, the soil and the climate, to create this product. So I think it is something that that resonates very deeply with a lot of people.
Hello and welcome to the European Guangxi podcast. My name is Imi and I will be hosting this episode on China and the world of wine with our guest Fongyee Walker. Now Fongyee started becoming interested in wine while reading classical Chinese at Cambridge University. She then relocated to Beijing in 2007, founding Dragon Phoenix Wine Consulting and also becoming the first Master of Wine resident in China. She is now a wine consultant, educator and international judge, judging and speaking on wines from all over the world. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So my first question for you today is, we've heard a little bit about how you first got interested in wine while studying classical Chinese. Now, I'm very interested as to how those two subjects potentially link, or if they don't link at all, what it was that brought you into the world of wine.
Yeah, it sounds very, very strange, doesn't it? You are there at Cambridge doing classical Chinese and you get sucked into the wine world, but the wine world is like that, isn't it? It would appear that they have no links, but actually studying classical Chinese poetry, the Chinese poets love the glass of wine. They love the tipple. So I regard myself as following in their footsteps. However, I actually went into wine a little bit more seriously than that, because I found out that at Cambridge there was a wine tasting team. You're talking a sport. And I found out about it and I thought, this is strange. You have to taste wine silently and then discuss. But I went and I was really hooked on it, because wine for me is more than a cultural artifact. It's also something you can tangibly taste and smell and see and revel in that wonderful flavors and aromas. So I thought, wow, this is really good. And I enjoyed it tremendously. And then I found out that teaching wine is actually a little bit more fun than teaching classical Chinese. Sorry about that. And that's when I began to sort of jump from the world of literature into the world of wine.
Yeah, so with your background, it's evident that you have a really solid background and understanding on the history of wine, both in Europe and also in China as well. So just for our listeners, I was wondering if you could sort of give a brief summary of how wine in those two cultures differs.
Oh my goodness, a brief summary of how wine in those two cultures differ. That is a very hard remit, because as we know, first of all, Europe has an incredibly long history of wine made from grapes. Now, here's the problem. When you say wine in Chinese, you generally just say jiu, which of course means anything that contains alcohol. Booze, if you like it. But when we talk about wine in English, we generally mean wine made from grapes. So that's a little bit different. Wine from grapes, their history is hugely long in Europe. Goes back 8,000 years to, Georgia, Turkey, that area. But it took a little bit longer for those grapes to travel along the Silk Road into China. So we don't see mentions of real wine made from grapes until about 2,000 years ago, give or take. And then it's even not that common, because China's not an easy place to grow grapes to make wine. And so it never really spread from the far west of China. It was always regarded as quite exotic and quite different, and ooh la la, I am drinking this Wild West wine, However, when we reach the Qing dynasty, so in the last 200 years, we definitely see, due to the influx of Westerners, particularly those missionaries from France, because we all know Catholic priests maybe like a bit of a tipple. They also need the wine for their mass. So they brought in the great varieties that we now know as the famous ones, the Pinot Noir, the Cabernet Sauvignon. And they brought those into China. And from there, they started to develop a little bit more of the industry. In fact, we have the first Chinese winery being set up in Shandong at the end of the 19th century. And that's continued till today. But I have to say, if we're going to talk about really Chinese people getting into wine culture, that's got to be in the last 20 years. And the wineries in China have exploded. The interest in wine has exploded. And we see a lot of urban consumers making wine part of their everyday life.
Yeah, fantastic. So you talk about how there's been this explosion in the number of vineyards and just in the wine industry in general. And we have a bit of a visual display here today of some of the different regions in China that are now increasingly producing wine. I was wondering if you could introduce your selection a little bit today.
Okay, I'll try and do it in some sort of logical order. So first of all, starting over here, we have wines from the highest altitude vineyards almost in the world. Argentina is fighting with China for that title. Right now, I think China does hold it. There are some wineries in the mountains in Tibet. These mountain area is called collectively the Shangri-La region. Very pretty name, isn't it? And it's actually at the head of the Mekong River. So if you can ever think about drinking wine from the riverbanks of the Mekong River, that's kind of crazy. But this is where the Mekong River starts, and they are immensely high mountains going up to 5,000 meters that have vineyards going up to 2,000 or 3,000 meters. So they create red wine, white wine, and even some ice wine comes from there. Then the other place next to it is diametrically opposite. This comes from almost no altitude, but right by the ocean. This is from Shandong, and this winery is actually not far from Qingdao. So if you've ever been to Qingdao to eat their seafood, some nice clams, wow, you can use the Chardonnay from just outside of Qingdao to go with that. And then this winery is one of my favorites because I can drive to it from where I live. It's just outside of Beijing. It's in an area called Huailai. They're producing some gorgeous wines. We have then going way out to the west, certainly cannot drive unless you want to spend a week on the road, is Xinjiang. And these come from the most extreme vineyards. The daytime temperature, 40 degrees. Nighttime, you have to pull on a big sweater. But crazy though the climate is, produces some wonderful wines. Then we have here Gansu, which a lot of people might not even have heard of, but they have quite a few vineyards. And then lastly is China's biggest region, which is a region called Ningxia province near the capital of Yinchuan. And this area is very famous because it's quite high altitude, it's got brilliant sunny days, and it produces generally full-bodied reds, but some very pretty whites as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see such a range of different climates as well. I think I was always under the impression that you needed one specific type of climate to grow the grapes that make wine, but I hadn't realized, I guess, there's so many different options, and I would be right in assuming these wines all taste very different because of that climate?
Absolutely. We have a really wide range of climates in China. Not all of them suit growing grapes. A lot of them, there's too much rainfall. But the ones that can, due to their differences in altitude and stuff like that, they produce very, very different styles of wine. It's kind of like France. You can get everything from champagne down to a big, rich Bordeaux.
So we've spoken a bit about the kind of exciting possibilities in Chinese wine at the moment. I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the potential difficulties that the industry has been facing or is facing in the future. So to my understanding, three of the main ones would be firstly kind of things to do with land ownership and autonomy of those vineyards. So whether it's maybe difficult for vineyard owners to be able to do everything they need to do within their vineyards in order to cultivate the very best wine. I think also there's issues around that kind of made in China label, whether it's difficult for these excellent wines to actually get out of China, and how do we sell those wines both within China and abroad, and also issues potentially around climate change. That is an increasingly growing problem, whether you think that could be a problem in the future as well.
Yes, I think climate change is actually one of those big things that's challenging wine industries around the world. But I think in China, that problem is kind of writ large because, first of all, starting from growing of the grapes, the Chinese climate is not an easy one to grow grapes in. Unlike places like, say, California or Spain, our rainfall in China comes in the summertime when the grapes are really, really ready to become rotten if there's too much rain on them. Whereas like California, Spain, Australia, we see much more rain in the wintertime. So that's a really big challenge. The other challenge is because our winters are really dry, grapevines aren't the toughest of plants. So because Chinese winters are dry and cold, you need to bury the plants underneath the soil every single year. Now, just think about the cost of labor of doing that and burying them under soil and then unburying them in the spring. So we've got those challenges. And if climate change continues to make our climates less predictable, more extreme, then the winters are going to get colder and harsher, and those summers are going to bring more rain. That's a really big challenge that the wineries need to consider. Maybe they'll have to do different grape varieties. I don't know. It's something that actually the last vintage, that was a really tough one. But then if you talk about the actual people and laws and how they affect Chinese wine, you really have to look a lot at like vineyard ownership. You're absolutely right. You know, due to the way that land ownership is structured in China, vineyard land is classified as agricultural land. And as you know, agricultural land has a lot of quite strict rules on how it can be used. And given that the land does not outright belong to the winery owner or the vineyard owner, it is a property of the state, then it gets very difficult because vineyards are really long term. You know, the best vineyards in the world are ones that have been under cultivation for hundreds of years. Some of the vines grow to hundreds of years old. You know, go to Australia, 150-year-old vines. The trouble is in China that you can only sign the contract for, 30 years. And that makes it very difficult to have this really long-term vision that you generally need for wine. But then you also have another challenge, which I'm going to bring up, which maybe surprises you, is that the rules regarding production of wine in China are not rules specifically for wine production. They're about food production, which creates actually additional levels of difficulty because it means that the material, the grapes arriving at your winery are treated like flour would be, or butter arriving at a biscuit factory, which is not the same because wine undergoes fermentation, which essentially completely changes it. However, Chinese wineries have to follow very strict rules for food production, which don't necessarily make sense for wine, and they add to the difficulty. But once you've gone through all those challenges and actually got your darn wine in the bottle, then you've got another challenge. Domestically, you can sell your wine. There are wine drinkers in China, but you're fighting against a lot of good imported wine. You got to give those people a reason to buy your wine. And then if you export, oh my goodness, your problems then multiply exponentially. The world of export wine markets is cutthroat. Many people compete on price. Chinese wine has extra grape growing costs like burial that people don't realize. And it means that when you bring the wines to, say, London and show them someone, they're priced much higher than an equivalent wine from somewhere else. Added to that, you have the made in China stigma. And admittedly, that's become a lot better, I would say, in the last 10 years, but it's still got the made in China. And in wine, it's writ large because unlike solar panels or electric cars or washing machines, wine is an organic agricultural product that speaks of the land. And when people think of China, maybe they do think of iPhone factories and mega cities. They certainly don't think about rolling hills with verdant vines and crystal clear water and beautiful sunshine, which does exist, but they don't think about that. And also they don't think about China as having wine history. And we can see, France does a very good job of selling wine through its links with wine cultural history.
With all of these challenges, that it obviously requires a lot of sort of different skills to be able to actually make it in the industry. I was wondering, what do you think defines the people who do manage to make it, who do become very successful? I think obviously marketing, as we can even see with these bottles, is a really important part of it. Lovely labels, very artistic. So just briefly, if you have any thoughts on what it takes to really sell Chinese.
Well, first of all, I have to repeat to you a very old joke, which is, how do you make a small fortune in wine? You start with a very large one. And in China, that is very, very true. Luckily, in China, we do have a large amount of committed, passionate people who have made large amounts of money in other endeavors, from coal to real estate to electronic goods. And they've decided, because of passion, because of reconnection with the agricultural world and the land, that they've decided to invest that money into building a vineyard, building a winery, and developing Chinese wine. And I really want to thank them, because I think those kind of people, those passionately, privately owned wineries that really put quality first, they've been the real drivers behind this kind of improvement that we've seen in Chinese wine in the last 20 years.
And another aspect of the Chinese wine industry, which I think is very, very interesting, also for our listeners as well, is, as I've heard, it's quite a female-led industry. And it's something that I found quite exciting when I first... It's always exciting to hear about a female-led industry. I was wondering what your experiences of that have been, if you feel that you've had a particular experience being a woman in the wine industry, what that's been like in China.
I think being a woman in the wine industry in China is very, very positive. We see it from our students. Our usual class breakdown is maybe 10-20% male, and the rest are usually highly educated, highly intelligent, passionate women who may be studying for fun or are studying because they really want to get into this industry. I think that the world of wine in China is particularly welcoming to women from several different points of view. First of all, the traditional business drink, of course, is baijiu, which is very, very high proof spirits. And when you think about the image, it's the typical chain smoking, sort of gambe, they're chucking back the very high alcohol male. And wine is viewed as a little bit more elegant, more sophisticated, has a veneer of more sociability. And I think that image is very, very attractive to women. Also, more and more women who have been successful in a lot of other industries where they've had to be quite tough and quite powerful, they're then attracted to make their second industry wine, because wine is more about personal choice. It's about expression. A lot of these women haven't had the chance to really express their own true nature. And then wine gives it. The owner of this winery, for instance, she was a very hardcore business lady from Sichuan, dealing deals, being tough. And then she went on holiday to Shangri-La. She saw a vineyard with an ancient walnut tree. And she said, this is where my soul needs to be. This is where I need to connect to. And you meet so many women like this. This is another women own. In fact, there's a lot of women owners here, but they see wine as a personal expression. And I think in China, that type of person is increasingly common. And I think that this seeing Chinese faces who have led the way in wine has encouraged other Chinese women to join and be part of this driving group.
I'm just going to quickly consult a quote as well, that what you've just been talking about has reminded me of one of your quotes, something that you something that you said not long ago in an interview.
Anything I say will be held in my defense, I must add.
So you mentioned wine is climate and it is soil, but it is passed through the medium of people, and it is the people who act as the bridge between heaven and earth to express the wine, and that is the spirit of ancient China, which is a very beautiful explanation. I hope I've quoted that correctly. I think you've spoken a lot about the spirit of the people involved in making wine, how it's much more than a kind of it's much more personal, much more tailored kind of industry that gives people that freedom of expression. Do you think that there's a sort of continuity between ancient ideas around wine, or ideas around wine and the way people practice it today, or does it feel like a completely separate new industry?
I think that there's so much in traditional Chinese culture where agricultural things resonate with people. Even though we all live in these huge cities, I think there's still a deep connection, even if you look at the Chinese lunar calendar. You know, even though we live in the city, when it comes to the Lidong, you know, when winter arrives, marked in the traditional agricultural calendar, everyone in the city knows it. Everyone knows that you should go out and eat some jiaozi dumplings. And it's got a more intimate connection than I think many cultures in the West, who have become somewhat more divorced from that. So I do think there is an element of that. And also Chinese culture traditionally, there is a connection between heaven and earth, and it is the medium of the people. And I think that that is the wonderful thing that wine is, because it contains so much of human culture, human history, but then you are reliant on heaven and earth, the soil and the climate, to create this product. So I think it is something that that resonates very deeply with a lot of people.
So we've kind of covered a lot of the present state of the industry, and also thought a bit about history as well. I was wondering if there's anything coming up in the future, any particular maybe upcoming brands, any regions that you think are growing, or anything that's really exciting in the wine industry that our listeners should know about, want the insider take on what's coming up.
Well, I think if you study business and different elements of business, you realize that the wine industry in the world is at a little bit of a crisis. And the thing that irritates me about reporting is that they always make a crisis into a drama. And you know, what's happened in the Chinese wine market in the last 5 years has been fascinating, because before COVID, the wine market was growing and growing, but everyone blew this out of proportion. They said, oh my God, China is importing. It's going to become the biggest, most important wine market in the world. And I kept on saying, no, it's not. Because people are importing without knowing who to sell to. And wineries are making wine without knowing who to sell to, because we don't understand who's drinking wine in China. Now, in the last 5 years, the imports have dropped. And of course, there we go. You can't have a crisis without major drama. Oh my God, China's destroyed. No one's drinking wine in China. Oh, it's all collapsing. Whereas I think the picture that is emerging is actually much more compelling. Because what I'm seeing now more and more is people who are actually in love with wine. They're not drinking it because they need to go to a banquet with some business partners and drink themselves under the table, you know, toasting the new venture. They're drinking it because it's an extension of how they feel inside. It's a way of conveying the way they view the world. You know, if they want to be fun and get together with friends, they'll drink a little bit of like bubblies, things like that. It's much closer to what we see in the West. And that, to me, is a wine market that is sustainable. And because of that, we see a shift in the Chinese wine market. Instead of importing all this rather boring, dry red wine from famous regions, you know, Bordeaux, Australian Shiraz, which was driving those import figures, instead of that, the consumers now, because they're looking at wine as part of their personality, like wearing clothes, you wouldn't choose to wear the same clothes every day. So they're buying, bubbles. They're buying white wine. That's influencing our market. The country that's growing some of the quickest imports into China is Germany and also New Zealand. And looking at Chinese wine, we've got white wine, we've got pink wine, yay! We've got sweet wine, showing that the Chinese consumers are looking for a broader experience. Now, to me, because there, wine is part of your personal expression of self, that's a sustainable market. That's the one that's growing. And that's the one that shows the great potential that China has. It's not going to suddenly zoom up like people like to hear, but what it's going to do is it's going to grow sustainably, which I think in the end is what we need to encourage this kind of wine economy. We need that engagement. And that to me is all engines forward, very positive for China. And I see it in our wine education. I see people passionate about wine coming to study it. Over 10 years ago, I was the only master of wine studying in China. I passed in 16. Now we've got 5 masters of wine resident in China. We have about 12 students aiming for this qualification. We have classrooms full of people from Chengdu to Beijing to Shanghai looking to learn about wine. I think that's so positive.
Yeah. I was also wondering, so you speak about becoming a master of wine. Just quickly, I think it would be helpful to clarify, what does that look like? We had a conversation about this before we started filming as well, and I learned it's not the same as the usual masters. It's very, very challenging, very competitive, very difficult. So what does it mean to be a master of wine?
So I am very proud to be a master of wine, and I'm also very proud to be involved in the education of the next generation, which is why I'm wearing this very casual sweatshirt, because this is the one we get as teachers for the Master of Wine. So the Master of Wine, a lot of people think of masters, they think of going to university. It's tough to get in, you have to be a really good student, but you get in, you get to your classes, you write your paper, and you get through. A Master of Wine isn't like that. A Master of Wine is really more like a mastership proving test. And so what it is actually the world's hardest set of wine exams. More people have been into space than have passed these exams. So the pass rate is usually less than 10%. There's a huge attrition rate. 100 people start, maybe 9 or 10 people will end up with the qualification. It goes through many stages, and the most challenging is 4 days, where from morning to evening, you have to write wine exams, taste wines blind, write about them. 4 days together, you get exhausted by the end. It's like a marathon. If you are lucky enough to pass those, and you cannot pass them in bits, you have to pass whole chunks together, you get the privilege of writing a research paper. Mine was on Chinese wine production. And then if you go through all those hoops, you get inducted into being a master. And then we are a society which then your aim is to bring other people up to that level. Yeah.
So just for our listeners, do you have any advice, any tips for anyone who wants to learn more about Chinese wine, or even any industry in China that's growing today?
What I say about the market in China, you can't get that from statistics. You can't get that from reading the press. You get that from being on the ground, from talking to people, to meeting people. And I think this is a really important thing, is I think there's a lot of people who comment on China, and they come here for like a week, and they live in what I like to call Hiltonia. Do you understand what I mean? It's the 5-star hotels. Mm-hmm. I think if you really want to know about China, if you really want to understand what's happening here, there's nothing more important than coming here. Boots on the ground, integrating in the community, understanding how people think, talking, gossiping, playing. It doesn't have to be serious. But the more you do that, the more you can understand this country that is China, the more it can open your eyes. And it's something that rewards a lifetime of study. I feel privileged because even though it was many years ago I did classical Chinese, I live here and I learn more every single day. And I think that's the point to life, just learning more and more.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. Your answers were fascinating, and it was great to hear about Chinese wine from someone who really, really knows what they're talking about. Thank you.
I don't dare say I really know anything, but I have to say, Chinese wine, great future, and thank you for having me, and I hope you get to drink a glass soon.
I hope so too.